We asked our business customers for their most dramatic security stories. They don't have any.
Now, when you're talking about a good story, isn't the best story none at all? Hey, remember that one time the whole network went down because we got hit with ransomware?
Nope.
See? We've been using malware bytes for 8 years or more, so we don't have any scary, exciting stories. Sorry, no drama here. Not in my house.
AI-powered cyber protection that just works, so you can too. Malwarebytes.
Good morning, everybody. Show of hands, who stayed up way too late? I'm proud of you for making it here. Thank you. I'm on like my third coffee. I talked so much yesterday, I thought I was getting like every cold you could get in Vegas. I was croaking. No, it's just talking. I haven't seen so many friends in one place, it feels like forever. And so yeah, it's awesome. Awesome to see everybody here. So I'm glad you all came back for the second day. Hey, before I introduce our day 2 keynote, Kim Zetter, it's our 25th anniversary, and we were trying to think of keynotes that we would find interesting that maybe explored some side angles that you don't traditionally hear at a keynote for Black Hat or DEF CON. And one that is around the media, around the press. And if you've been in this space for a while, you know there's sort of been a love-hate relationship with the media. If you have a good interaction with the media, or you and your company, it could make a big difference in your career and what you're doing. But if you have a bad experience in the media, right, especially today with Twitter and social media, it can really break you. And so, figuring out who the people in the media are, the reporters that you can trust, could be a really big deal. And for me, starting out decades and decades ago, it was fascinating to see that reporters even cared what us hackers were doing. Right? So that was a big ego boost. Wow, somebody cares. They want to write about us. And then we would start reading what they were writing. They're like, they seem to fixate on the color of our hair. It seems to be really important, like what energy drinks we're drinking, or all the color around it, and the actual there was kind of lacking. And so, as we shared notes with each other, like who did you talk to, how was the coverage, we started realizing there's a lot of people that want to cover hacking and technology, and there's a few people who actually can. And so we would share notes on who those people were. And there was actually some mailing lists back then. I think attrition.org had a list of sort of known good reporters you could talk to, known bad reporters you would stay away from that could, weren't too interested in the facts. And so we had some adventures over the years. We ended up banning all of Las Vegas local television from covering any of our events, because they would do this thing where, yes, we're so interested. And then there'd be like a blue-haired person like here at the computer. And that camera would come in, and swirl around the blue hair, swing past all the lock picking and out the door. And it'd be like, cyber criminals in Vegas this weekend, what you need to know. And you can only have that happen so many times, and you're just like, no thank you, television. And so we focused on print reporters. And the print reporters are the ones, those are your friends. right? They're used to interviewing people. They're used to looking at multiple sources. Their deadline is not quite the same as the television guy. And so we quickly pivoted toward those are the people that we want to spend our time introducing our friends to. Also, it's not the only time that we've been infiltrated by kind of ill-meaning media. There's a Michelle Madigan scenario where To Catch a Predator, if you remember that show, sent a reporter in undercover to DEF CON with a little hidden camera, and they're going to try to get essentially underage kids to admit to doing computer crimes. And so they didn't get a media pass. We knew this was happening ahead of time a little bit. We had a sort of a heads up, something weird's going on. And so we had like all these goons following her and intercepting anybody before she could try to get them to do something incriminating. And then I outed her on stage, which was kind of a risky move to make, but I tried to give her a chance to correct her mistake and identify as media, and she sat there in the front row with her little hidden camera pointed right at me, like not gonna out herself. And so this is a long way of saying that the history between both sides is pretty fraught, kind of like hackers and spies, hackers and government, right? There's this love-hate relationship. And so when we're thinking of who do we want that has a long history in this space, that understands the nuances of both sides and has been there, Kim Zetter's name came right to the top. If you don't know Kim, she's been, 13 years at Wired. She's experienced Politico, New York Times, Washington Post, Motherboard, Vice, you know, she's been around, and over time she's evolved to reporting, covering election, covering digital espionage, covering traditional cybercrime, and so I've been interviewed by her a few times, and what I can tell you is it's never 100% comfortable feeling because she is like, has what I consider knowledge, insight, she has the integrity, she's not going to shy away from a hard question, right? It's not, there's not a softball situation, but it feels real. Like you get done with an interview from Kim and you feel like, I survived. I can do this. And so because of that, her reporting, I think, is very insightful. And so I'm really curious to see how she has been thinking about the last 10 years, post-Snowden, around, well, what have we learned? What have we not learned, right? What has changed? What is not changing? And especially with her long-time perspective, looking back and looking forward, sort of the theme this year, right? Where do we come from? But also, where are we going? And so it's really my pleasure to introduce Kim Zetter.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to see everyone after 2 years of being apart. I wanted to thank Black Hat, and especially Jeff, for that great introduction. Really appreciate it. But I wanted to thank Black Hat for bringing me to speak with you this morning. I think it is the first time that they've brought a journalist to do a keynote. They've told me that there are 2 keynotes, and the first one is generally done by someone from industry and the government, and the second one is done by someone in the community. As a journalist, of course, I have to strive to be independent and impartial, but I do consider myself, broadly speaking, a member of this community because I've known so many of you for so long, and I feel honored that the InfoSec community considers me a member of it as well. So I want to start this morning by telling you a story about a source that approached me. This was a while ago, back in 2006, when I was writing for Wired. He came to me with what seemed like an implausible story. This was after a series of massive breaches of bank card numbers had occurred, and the source told me that he had a front row seat to all of the action, that he knew the real names of all the players, and that he was right in the thick of things. He claimed he'd been working for the FBI undercover for 18 months, running an underground carding forum, so that he could see how the cybercriminals planned their conspiracies, sold access to hacked systems, trafficked in hacking tools, stolen identities and bank card numbers, and even wrote customer reviews, like on Yelp, grading the goods and customer service of their criminal colleagues. He was talking about how the hackers would also launder money through digital currency. In this case, it was e-gold, the precursor to Bitcoin before it was launched in 2009. The source claimed that he had been flipped by the FBI, and it was a great tale that he was telling, but there was one problem. He was a professional liar. He had started his career writing bad checks, and then he eventually ended up as a mule for Russian and Ukrainian hackers. He would receive high-end electronic goods that they would buy with stolen bank cards. Then he would fence the goods, and then he would send the money to them in Ukraine or Belarus or Russia using e-gold. So the source had claimed that he had gotten flipped by the FBI after he got arrested one day and during doing one of his mule operations, and the FBI installed him in an apartment in Seattle where he ran this underground forum. Now, there was no way that the FBI was going to confirm this tale, no way that they were going to confirm that the source had worked undercover for them, but the source had receipts, as they say. He gave me the name of the public defender who had witnessed the jailhouse interview where the FBI had flipped him. And he had hundreds of chat logs, private chat logs from the forum that he ran, showing the hackers planning their criminal operations, bickering over botched deals and double-crossing partners, and laughing about how no one would ever catch them because US law enforcement was too ignorant and too unskilled, too technically challenged to understand what was going on. So for the next 6 months, I had to try and work to confirm everything he was telling me. I tracked down victims of the criminal schemes that were plotted in the chat logs. I got the public defender who had witnessed the jailhouse interview, and he reluctantly acknowledged that the FBI did indeed flip him. And I tracked down the former manager of the apartment complex in Seattle, who told me that the FBI did pay the rent on the apartment and also gave him a phone number to call in case the source ever got out of line. So I'm telling you this tale because it could easily be a tale from last year or even last month, not 2006. There's nothing substantially different today about how hackers run their criminal enterprises. They still organize in underground forums, they still operate as businesses in hierarchical structure, and they still make money, lots of it, which they launder through digital currency. The main difference is they've had more than a decade to perfect their operations and become more professional. And now they offer salaried employment to their workers and even paid vacations. But they still bicker, they still double-cross one another, and they still think law enforcement won't catch them. And sometimes they're right about that. So there's very little that's new under the sun. As they say, the details may differ, but the same things happening two decades ago still occur today. So here's a ransomware story from 2008 with all the same elements as ransomware attacks today: digital currency to collect the ransom, a victim caught off guard, and a Russian government that's not willing to cooperate with the US authorities. What's new today, of course, is the size of the ransoms. $500 was large back then. Today, they run into $5 million or more. And also the targeting of critical infrastructure, hospitals, food manufacturing plants, and a pipeline, as opposed to targeting individuals. One of the big cases, of course, of ransomware was the Colonial Pipeline hack last year, which reached national security proportions and prompted the government to finally address pipeline security after more than a decade of being largely hands-off. And it was a watershed moment, as they say. But if anyone was surprised by the attack, they shouldn't have been, because it was entirely predictable. When Stuxnet was discovered in 2010, it shone a light on vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure that few had noticed before. The security community largely had focused on IT networks until then, and now they had previously ignored what are known as operational networks, the OT networks. Industrial control systems, all of those systems that manage pipelines and railways and the electric grid and water treatment plants and manufacturing and so many other pivotal industries. Stuxnet provided stark evidence that physical destruction of critical infrastructure using nothing more than code was possible. But no one should have been surprised. There had been warnings about the use of digital weapons to disrupt or destroy critical infrastructure a decade prior to Stuxnet. And the same year that Stuxnet was discovered, Operation Aurora was exposed. Many of you probably remember this. It was a widespread espionage campaign by China that hit 34 companies and targeted source code repositories at Google, Adobe, and Juniper, and included one of the first significant supply chain operations targeting RSA's seed repository, the engine for its multi-factor authentication systems. Aurora introduced the public to APTs, advanced persistent threats, and the growing capabilities of nation-state hackers. The security community, which had largely been focused on cyber criminals until then, began to focus more on nation-state actors and the sophisticated techniques that made the actions of cyber criminals feel kind of quaint. Hacking operations became more aggressive and more consequential. The OPM hack, the DNC hack, NotPetya, SolarWinds, but none of this should have been a surprise. The hackers behind Operation Aurora went after, as I mentioned, source code repositories through source code management systems, the systems that track changes and updates to source code, which turned out to have security holes. Here's what Dmitry Alperovich, then vice president of threat research at McAfee, said about it in 2010. The source code management systems were wide open. No one ever thought about securing them, yet these were the crown jewels of most of these companies in many ways, much more valuable than any financial or personally identifiable data that they may have and spend so much time and effort protecting. And here's what someone told me last year after hackers injected a backdoor into the SolarWinds software during the build process. Quote, software makers had all these safety mechanisms for detecting changes to source code in the source code repository, but none protecting the build environment, because no one had ever injected malware into the software build process before. Do you spot the pattern? There's a lack of imagination or a lack of anticipation about the next move that hackers will make. This is often the case here. Sorry. So I call this talk Pre-Stuxnet, Post-Stuxnet, everything has changed, nothing has changed, because Stuxnet in the year 2010 is often seen as a demarcation in security between what preceded it and what came after. There have been a lot of real advancements in security since Black Hat was founded 25 years ago, and a lot of advancements even since Stuxnet was discovered in 2010. But despite a multi-billion-dollar security industry and an unprecedented government focus on threats, everyone still seems to be surprised when threat actors pivot to new but often wholly predictable directions. There are a few things that truly blindside us, however. The rest cast signals long before they occur. What happened with Colonial Pipeline last year was foreseeable, as was the growing threat of ransomware and the problems created by security issues with voting machines, something I've covered a lot of over the years. Russians going after election infrastructure in 2016, really we should have been asking what took them so long, not being surprised by that. We have a habit of reacting to threats after they occur rather than preparing for them, or of ignoring voices of reason that warn of impending problems, only to scramble into action when they occur. That is when panicked drivers are lining up at East Coast gas stations trying to fill up a trunk full of canisters with gasoline. Or when election officials turn rogue and undermine the public trust in voting. So I want to talk today a bit about the changes in the security landscape after Stuxnet and the changes that Stuxnet brought, and the things we ignore until it's almost too late. But first, for those who might not know my work, I know that Jeff talked a bit about it, but I'll just give you a brief background. I began covering security in my first reporting job at PC World, where I worked for just a couple of years before I moved to Wired. As Jeff said, I wrote for Wired for 13 years until I left in 2016. And I started attending Black Hat and DEF CON during the early years when DEF CON was still held at the Alexis Park Hotel off the Strip. That was when there were about 1,000 attendees to DEF CON instead of 30,000. Las Vegas has always had a lot to distract people from the conference talks, but at 3 a.m. in the August heat, There was probably no better place to be than at the Alexis Park Pool Con, as we called it, where you could wade in 3 swimming pools, get lost in deep technical or philosophical conversations to the backbeat of a techno soundtrack, and make lifelong friends. There wasn't such a thing as a security beat in those days, at least not outside the tech press. Reporters in mainstream media parachuted in to cover security only when a major virus or a data breach affected mainstream audiences. This tended to produce mistrust in the media, a feeling that journalists didn't really care about security except to spread hype and focus on the antics of black hat hackers. But after the Snowden leaks and the DNC hack, a lot of media realized that they needed to have full-time reporters on a security beat who understand the issues and could really translate these technical and complex issues to mainstream audiences. And so today we have a host of really great reporters that are covering this beat. When I first began attending Black Hat and DEF CON, I had a huge learning curve. I didn't come from a tech background. I was an English literature major. I was studying Joyce and Chaucer, not Java and C++. But if you were committed to getting things right and had genuine curiosity, people were open and willing to talk. And from the first days, I had a seasoned group of hackers and security pros that helped me sort through all of the technical details and avoid and sidestep the hype. So in those days, I covered WikiLeaks and Julian Assange before they became really household names. I covered the early years of their first leaks. I broke the story with a colleague about Chelsea Manning's arrest for leaking government documents. And I covered that trial at the NSA campus. I exposed a secret AT&T room in Missouri used by the NSA to spy on internet traffic. This was years before Snowden exposed the surveillance program in its broad swath. And I wrote numerous stories about the carding underground and about election security, trying to bring attention to something few people wanted to pay attention to back then. And then finally, something shifted in 2010 with the discovery of Stuxnet. When the Aurora campaign and Stuxnet occurred, much of my focus of coverage turned to nation-state hackers, digital infrastructure, and of course, cyber war. Which brings me to what I want to talk about now, which are the changes that Stuxnet brought. So aside from introducing, sorry, I've lost my place here. So aside from introducing the world to cyber warfare, Stuxnet brought about 4 major changes in security. The first one was a trickle-down effect of techniques and tools. Prior to Stuxnet, innovations in computer attacks were driven largely by the criminal underground, with nation-state hackers learning novel techniques from hackers and researchers. But after Stuxnet, the tools and techniques that nation-states developed began trickling down to the criminal underground. Instead of government learning from the underground was starting to learn from government. After Duku, maybe many of you remember this was a spy tool that was created by some of the same team behind Stuxnet. After Duku was discovered in 2011, exploits attacking the same font rendering vulnerability that Duku attacked were added to toolkits sold in the criminal underground. And it wasn't a year before it was the most commonly targeted vulnerability used to install banking trojans and other malware. The same thing occurred with the infamous .lnk vulnerability that Stuxnet used. In 2016, in 2016, 6 years after Stuxnet exploited it, the .lnk vulnerability accounted for 25% of all exploits used. Microsoft had patched the vulnerability back in 2010, but in 2015, researchers discovered that the patch was ineffective and hackers were still exploiting it. So the next big change that Stuxnet brought was the launch of a cyber arms race among nations. This heralded the militarization of cyberspace. Stuxnet demonstrated the viability of resolving geopolitical conflicts through cyber attacks, and suddenly everyone wanted in the game. Before, only a handful of nations had offensive hacking programs, but after Stuxnet, many launched their own cyber commands for spying and destructive attacks, including Iran, the target of Stuxnet, where an official told university students to prepare for the coming cyber war with the country's enemies. The next thing that Stuxnet brought was the politicization of security research and defense. Stuxnet had conducted its stealth sabotage for 3 years, from 2017 to 2010, before it was caught, until workers at an antivirus firm in Belarus discovered it, and researchers at Symantec and others around the world reverse engineered the digital weapon to determine what it was designed to do. The developers behind Stuxnet probably assumed Iranians didn't have the skills to uncover or decipher the malicious code, but they didn't count on the global cybersecurity community helping them. And with Stuxnet, a new world order was established, in which security researchers became the unwitting draftees in a new militia, one enlisted to dismantle the digital weapons that nations lobbed against each other. This created new ethical dilemmas for researchers caught between the needs of customers and the interests of an intelligence agency. If Stuxnet announced the militarization of cyberspace, it also signaled the politicization of security research, in which digital defenders might be asked to look the other way to avoid destroying the covert operations of their government. There's a new good guy. This is a quote from Eric Chin from Symantec. There's a new good guy and bad guy question here that puts us potentially in a very difficult situation. This is Eric Chin who told me this back in 2012 after they'd finished deciphering Stuxnet. Their research hadn't been marred by political influence. No one had tried to stop Symantec researchers from digging into Stuxnet. No one had stopped them from publishing their findings. But Chin knew that might not always be the case. And if his team was ever forced to choose between customers and government interests, he said, quote, "It's going to be a very hard question to answer." The last thing that Stuxnet did was introduce the security community to a world of vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure. As I mentioned earlier, Stuxnet brought awareness about vulnerabilities in the systems that operate pipelines, water treatment plants, et cetera. And once security researchers turned their sights to industrial control systems, they found a host of security vulnerabilities in the software. But not just that, also basic architectural problems that could never be fixed with a patch. And with so many systems directly connected to the internet, cybersecurity suddenly became interlinked with national security. But again, this shouldn't have surprised anyone. So let's look at what we would have seen had we been paying attention. In 1997, after Timothy McVeigh blew up a federal building in Oklahoma, the Marsh Commission was tasked with looking into ways that other critical infrastructure might be open to attack, either physically or through digital attacks. And in the final report they produced, the commissioners warned against a growing trend toward connecting critical control systems for oil, gas, and electricity to the internet. They wrote, "The capability to do harm is growing at an alarming rate, and we have little defense against it." This is 25 years ago. Commands sent to the control computer at a power plant could be just as devastating as a backpack full of explosives. We should attend to our critical foundations before we are confronted with a crisis, not afterward. Waiting for disaster would prove as expensive as it would be irresponsible. A second report released the same year by the White House National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee echoed exactly what they'd said, writing that an electronic intruder could dial into an unprotected port and reset the breaker to a higher level of tolerance than the device being protected by the breaker can withstand. It would be possible to physically destroy a given piece of equipment within a substation. The electric sector, because it's heavily regulated, did actually heed the warnings, and over time did eventually become more secure, but a lot of other critical infrastructure became more connected and more insecure. When Colonial Pipeline was hacked last year, many were surprised at how quickly the company paid the ransom. Surely a business this big and critical to the US economy as Colonial Pipeline is, they supply 45% of fuel to the East Coast, which amounts to about 2.5 million barrels of fuel daily. Surely it had sufficient backups and a response plan in place that it wouldn't need to pay the ransom. But as the company's CEO told lawmakers on Capitol Hill months later, although it did have an emergency response plan, that response plan didn't include ransomware attack. And even though ransomware attackers had been targeting critical infrastructure since 2015. So the signs were there if Colonial Pipeline had looked. In 2019, just 2 years before Colonial Pipeline was hit, Temple University began compiling statistics on ransomware that targeted critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure, of course, being defined as an entity within the 16 government categories designated by the government, based just on incidents reported in the media or publicly exposed by security firms. Temple researchers counted some 400 ransomware attacks on critical infrastructure in 2020, and a total of 1,246 attacks between November 13 and June 30th, 2022. These weren't just attacks on hospitals, which of course had been a big target for ransomware actors in 2016, but these were also targeting oil and gas facilities. And the attackers weren't just targeting IT systems, they were already going after the OT networks that are controlling the critical processes. In 2020, the year before Colonial Pipeline was hit, Mandiant reported that 7 ransomware families had struck industrial organizations since 2017, resulting in significant disruptions and delays in production and delivery of goods and services. Ransomware actors were becoming more sophisticated, Mandiant said, conducting internal reconnaissance in order to determine which systems were the most critical to production so that they could target those and demand a higher ransom. Both Mandiant and Dragos reported that ransomware targeting industrial organizations contained kill lists of more than 1,000 critical processes that they were designed to halt before they initiated the ransomware or the encryption and demanded a ransom. So if this wasn't warning enough, that same year, 2020, DHS's Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency published an alert warning specifically about ransomware attacks against pipelines. It described an attack against a natural gas compression facility that began with a phishing attack against the IT network. And once the attackers got into the IT network, they made their way to the corporate, from the corporate network to the OT network because they weren't properly segmented, and spread to the latter. And once the ransomware engaged, the operators were prevented from obtaining real-time control data, and it forced the plant to close down operations for 2 days. The plant didn't have a response plan at all for cyber attacks. In its 2020 alert, CISA advised pipeline and other critical infrastructure owners to have a response plan in place, to conduct red team exercises to simulate attacks and test responses, but put backups offline or only on fully segmented networks, and to build redundant workflows so they could maintain critical operations in the event of an attack. A year later, the ransomware struck Colonial Pipeline. The attackers got in through the company's VPN using an employee password, a password a worker had apparently reused elsewhere on other networks, because Mandiant found the password on leaked passwords online that had been stolen in another breach, though it's not clear if the Colonial Pipeline hacker actually obtained the password that way. But the VPN account was a legacy account that hadn't been disabled, and it also wasn't using multi-factor authentication. So it created a clear path for the attackers to get in once they had the password. The ransomware struck around 5 a.m. on May 7th, and by 6 a.m. the company had shut down its 5,500-mile pipeline. By late afternoon, CEO Joseph Blount decided to pay the ransom, which was sent out the next day, and as we all now know, the pipeline was down for nearly a week and resulted in a cascade of effects that Colonial Pipeline really couldn't control at that point, when frenzied consumers initiated a panic buy. The hack itself didn't inflate prices, it didn't cause a fuel shortage, but people responding to it did. In 2018, 3 years before Colonial Pipeline was hit, an audit of its systems found that it was deficient in security best practices. Robert Smallwood, whose consulting company did the audit, called Colonial Pipeline's information management practices atrocious and said the company had a patchwork of poorly connected and secured systems and lacked security awareness. Quote, an 8th grader could have hacked into that system, unquote, he said. Colonial Pipeline, which had no CISO when it got hacked last year, instead security duties fell to a deputy CTO, disputed Smallwood's characterization and said that its IT network was, quote unquote, strictly segregated from pipeline control systems. But the CEO, Blount, also told lawmakers that he shut down the pipeline because he was afraid the ransomware would spread to the OT network, suggesting they weren't as confident in their strict segregation as stated. And although Blount said his company had the ability to operate the pipeline manually, this was true only if a small portion of the pipeline went down, not if they shut down all 5,500 miles of it. He also said the company had good data backups, and yet the company paid the ransom. So why would a company pay the ransom if they had good data backups? Bill Siegel, who is CEO and co-founder of Coveware, told me last year that it's generally because a company never practiced restoring their data from backups before they got hacked. They might have 50 petabytes of data backed up, but if it's in a facility 30 miles away and they have to restore over a copper wire, it can take weeks or months to get the data they need. Or they might discover, when it's too late, that the applications that they need to actually do the data restoration are on the IT network that's locked. So I don't mean to beat up on Colonial Pipeline. They're just a convenient example because the attack was so significant, but other critical infrastructure is in the same position or worse. After the Colonial Pipeline hack, CISA released a lengthy list of basic security guidelines for pipelines. Isolate ICS SCADA systems and networks from corporate networks and the internet, and implement strong perimeter controls, limit communications leaving and entering those perimeters, use multi-factor authentication, have a cyber incident response plan in place, and maintain good offline backups. Pretty much the same guidelines that CISA had released in 2020 before Colonial Pipeline was hacked. When these came out, many wondered, why would CISA find the need to release these now? After years of red flags against critical infrastructure, shouldn't this already be obvious and shouldn't it already be done? But Colonial Pipeline, of course, showed that many of these measures were still not implemented, despite the fact that the Ukrainian power grid got hacked back in 2015 because they didn't have multi-factor authentication, despite the fact that a study by Google and 2 universities found that MFA can block up to 99% of bulk phishing attacks and about 66% of targeted attacks. A survey published this year by Trellix, which is a conglomeration of formerly FireEye and McAfee, Trellix survey found that 75% of respondents in the US oil and gas sector still don't have MFA fully implemented. And over half of them blamed it on a lack of in-house cyber skills. In 2013, I wrote about a researcher named Paul McMillan who used MassScan to find systems connected to the internet using port 5900, the port used by VNC and TeamViewer, 2 tools that critical infrastructure facilities often use for remote management, though they shouldn't. He wanted to see if he could access them. He found 30,000 connected systems that required no authentication to access controls. This included 2 hydroelectric plants in New York, a generator at a Los Angeles foundry, the automated feed system at a Pennsylvania pig farm, milk inventory controls for a Holstein farm in British Columbia, a system for monitoring and controlling ventilation for underground miners, and the refrigeration system for a food service company in Pennsylvania that provided lunch to schools and other facilities. That was 2013. Surely you think things are better now. But we all recall last year when hackers breached the Oldsmar water treatment facility in Florida through its TeamViewer application and changed the settings for sodium hydroxide levels in the water supply. The plant was using an out-of-date Windows operating system that Microsoft no longer supported. Its control system was directly connected to the internet without a firewall, and all of its operators used the same TeamViewer password to access the network. The fact that there aren't more attacks against critical infrastructure isn't because the systems are secure. It's mostly because attackers haven't been interested in disrupting or destroying them. After Stuxnet was discovered, people expected that there would be a lot of copycat attacks that would target critical infrastructure in other places. But that didn't happen, and it didn't happen for primarily 2 reasons, lack of will and lack of capability. Those who had the political will to launch such attacks, for example, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and who weren't necessarily deterred by the same things that deterred nation states, these people didn't have the capability to conduct sophisticated cyber attacks and were more focused on terror attacks anyway. They could have purchased mercenary skills, but they didn't because the terror attacks were so much more effective. And those who were capable of such sophisticated attacks, like Russia and China, lacked the political will to launch them and knew that any disruptive or destructive attack against US infrastructure, at least, would elicit an equal response or worse. As one US official put it, quote, "Shut down our power grid and maybe we'll put a missile down one of your smokestacks," end quote. But this has changed in recent years, and we've begun to see greater interest in disruptive and destructive attacks against critical infrastructure. This began in, of course, 2015 and 2016 with the Russian attacks against Ukraine's power grid. The ante was upped with a Trident attack in 2017 that targeted the safety mechanisms at a Saudi Arabia petrochemical plant and introduced the potential for attacks that cause physical harm or death. And the recent discoveries of Indestroyer 2, which could have caused a widespread blackout in Ukraine if not uncovered, and of course Pipe Dream, the expansive attack platform which researchers say had the potential to cause disruption or destruction. The version of Pipe Dream that was found appeared to be focused on liquefied natural gas systems, but it could be modified for use against any industrial environment and had the ability to disable or brick control systems or undermine safety systems in ways that could potentially endanger lives. So I want to move down now to election security because I've covered it so extensively over the years. And it's another sector of critical infrastructure that has long been ignored, despite warnings for years about insecurities. Election infrastructure was only added to the critical infrastructure list in 2017, 11 years after the list was first created in 2006. I need to preface this discussion, though, unfortunately, by recognizing that events of the past 2 years have made it hard for anyone to discuss legitimate election security problems without it being misappropriated by people looking to cast doubt on the 2020 presidential election and undermine the democratic process. But I think that there's a greater danger in not discussing the problems. They won't get corrected that way, and it will leave elections open to further integrity attacks. In order to understand the current state of affairs with election systems, we actually have to go back to the year 2000, to that presidential debacle in Florida. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. Back in Florida in 2000, you all remember when paper punch card ballots and dangling chads led to a call for recounts and a controversial Supreme Court ruling. After that election, US lawmakers moved to ban paper ballots, paper punch cards through the Help America Vote Act, which they proposed to give $4 billion to states to, among other things, replace the punch card systems with new electronic voting machines, preferably paperless ones, because the dangling chads had convinced lawmakers that all paper ballots were bad. There were already years of warnings against computers tabulating votes. A 1969 front-page article in the Los Angeles Times described an integrity test of new computerized election tabulators used by LA County. 3 computer scientists on a red team faced off against 3 computer scientists on a blue team to see if they could rig an election without detection. The red team won, repeatedly. Jump ahead 2 decades to 1984 in Rock Island County, Illinois. A computer tabulator gave one candidate 2 votes for every 1 cast for him. The next year in a different Illinois county, a punch card tabulator elected the wrong candidate for city council, which was only discovered in a recount. But even in the problematic 2000 Florida election that made lawmakers hate paper, a problem occurred with electronic voting machines in Volusia County. Volusia was already using electronic systems for about 4 years at that point. The incident should have given lawmakers pause about pushing states to buy electronic voting machines, if only they'd been paying attention. At 10 p.m. on election night, Democratic presidential candidate Al Gore was ahead in Volusia County with 83,000 votes to with 83,000 votes to George Bush's 62,000. Things were going well for Gore across the state, and exit polls projected a 6-point lead for him. But then something went wrong. Gore's total on the Volusia County website suddenly dropped by 16,000 votes. The drop occurred in Precinct 216. It was a community center located in a primarily elderly neighborhood. The results were showing that Gore's total was actually negative 16,022 votes, while George Bush had 2,183, and a Socialist Workers' Party candidate named James Harris had 9,888 votes. There was a problem, however. Precinct 216 only had 585 registered voters. And only 219 of those had cast ballots that day. Unfortunately for Gore, reporters were watching overall numbers for the state and not individual county returns. So they didn't notice the sudden drop. All they saw was that Gore was falling behind. The Voter News Service, a consortium of media outlets reporting election results, had projected Gore the Florida winner at 8 p.m., but when Gore lost 16,000 votes from his total in Volusia County, and another Florida county posted results that were inadvertently missing 4,000 votes for Gore, Bush shot into the lead. And news outlets retracted their call for Gore and called the state for Bush instead. Luckily, the electronic voting machines in Volusia County were optical scan machines. Optical scan machines use a paper ballot that voters fill out by hand and then put through a scanner to be tabulated. Because of that paper ballot, they can be manually retabulated by hand. So this meant that officials could actually get to the bottom of what happened and find the true results. Gore's team requested a manual recount in this county, in Volusia County, and 3 other counties, but the Supreme Court halted them, as you all remember, but not before Volusia actually completed its recounts. And the manual tally, in the end, showed that Gore actually got 193 votes. That says 192. Bush got 22 votes, and Harris got 0. After the election, Volusia officials blamed the problem on a faulty memory card. On election night, precinct workers were supposed to transmit the vote tallies via a modem that was connected to the voting machines, but that night in precinct 216, the modem failed, and so a worker drove in the memory card from the voting machine into the elections office, where it was inserted into the election management system to tabulate the votes. Logs for the management system, however, showed that 2 memory cards from precinct 216 were uploaded that night, an hour apart, and the 16,000 votes for Gore disappeared after that second card was loaded into the machine. The county's optical scan machines were made by Global Election Systems, a Canadian firm later acquired by Diebold and renamed Diebold Election Systems. So a Volusia County official worker sent an email to Diebold demanding an explanation about what went wrong. And a Diebold programmer replied that a corrupt memory card was the most likely explanation. But since the memory card was now nowhere to be found, the only evidence of its existence was in that computer log from election night, he couldn't say for sure. But then he posited an alternative, more ominous explanation. He said, quote, "There is always the possibility that the second memory card actually came from an unauthorized source," suggesting that someone, perhaps a rogue insider, had intentionally inserted a malicious card into the tabulation system to alter the election, but had botched the operation. To which a Diebold colleague of his replied, "Heh, second shooter theory. All we need now is a grassy knoll." Though there was some validity to the corrupt memory card explanation, Diebold had experienced problems with memory cards before. No one seemed to wonder why a corrupt memory card would alter votes only in the presidential race while leaving other races untouched. Nor did anyone ask what this meant for memory cards in other precincts or counties. Were any others corrupted as well? There was a curious lack of curiosity. Many months later, when Congress went to pass the Help America Vote Act, they held hearings to determine if they should be giving states money to buy election machines, and 2 respected computer scientists testified against it. One told the officials, any programmer can write code that displays one thing on the screen, records something else in the voting machine's computer log, and prints out something else as an entirely different result. I have freshmen who can do this, she said. But the problem with voting machines wasn't just hackers or rogue insiders or rogue programmers. If a corrupt memory card caused the problem in Volusia, something similar could go wrong in other elections. But the warnings went ignored, and states went on a buying spree, many of them purchasing paperless electronic voting machines. Before HAVA, just 9% of precincts in the US were using paperless voting machines, and after HAVA, that shot up to 67%. In the years that followed, computer security experts showed time after time that the voting machines were insecure, including here in Vegas at the DEF CON voting machine hacking village. But vendors and election officials actively fought back against any criticisms of the machines. They said the machines couldn't be hacked because they were never connected to the internet. Aside from the fact that we know air-gapped systems, thanks to Stuxnet, can be hacked, whether or not they're connected to the internet, it turned out that some voting machines actually did connect to the internet when they transmitted election results on election night. I need to add a footnote to this because this story, unfortunately, was seized by the Stop the Steal movement to back their claims of election fraud in 2020. This was a story about systems made by election systems and software. And the story is reporting that only some systems that have embedded modems were connecting to the internet to transmit the votes on election night. Because ES&S systems were not used in the counties and states that were being disputed by the Stop the Steal people, they appropriated this story anyway to imply that Dominion voting systems were connected to the internet. So this is why I talk about the sensitivities around continuing to report problems about this, because that information will be misused. For other systems, of course, that are not connected to the internet, rogue insiders, of course, are a potential threat. Though election officials have always been offended at the suggestion that election staff might not be trustworthy, the last 2 years, of course, have maybe changed their minds. Election officials have been indicted for giving unauthorized persons access to voting machines and voting machine software. And candidates in dozens of states, as you can see here, who are considered election deniers and doubters, are currently vying for offices that would give them authority over elections or access to voting machines. And here's one in Arizona who recently got the Republican nomination. So luckily, due to the work of election integrity activists and security researchers over the years, states like California have since banned paperless voting machines or reduced their reliance on them. Today, jurisdictions in just 6 states, Indiana, Louisiana, Mississippi, New Jersey, Tennessee, and Texas, still use paperless electronic machines as their principal voting equipment. Most other states use optical scan machines with paper ballots that can be audited. But even these systems have security and reliability issues, and the paper ballots mean nothing if no one ever looks at them. Few states conduct robust manual audits, the kind designed to catch software errors or manipulated results. Some just run the ballots a second time through the same optical scanner. Others that do manual audits typically only examine ballots from a random selection of 1% of precincts instead of a percentage of ballots across all precincts. So if the selected precincts aren't ones where problems occurred, the audit won't uncover it. I want to be clear that having robust audits won't necessarily prevent what occurred after the 2020 election. Robust manual audits were conducted after the election in some states, and the Stop the Steal proponents simply dismissed them. But some initial supporters of the election fraud claims did say the audits convinced them the fraud claims weren't real. And if audits can do this and also catch errors created by faulty voting software, then election integrity activists say this can only be good for democracy. In the time I have left, I want to shift focus slightly to Ukraine and something that isn't about vulnerable critical infrastructure per se, but has relevance to these systems and potential future threats against them. Poses potential future threats against them. I'm referring to cyber norms and the hacktivism that has been unleashed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as some recent events in Iran. Just as Stuxnet altered the cybersecurity landscape, recent events in Ukraine and Iran have the potential to do the same with regard to cyber norms and the security of civilian infrastructure. Before I proceed, though, I want to acknowledge that, of course, the situation in Ukraine is unprecedented. And this isn't meant to criticize the country for doing what it thinks is necessary to defend itself, but the security community and governments have to be aware of the potential path that this is leading us to. In 2015, government experts from 20 nations, including the US, the UK, and Estonia, were tasked by the United Nations with developing cyber norms that states should follow. They agreed that states should not intentionally damage another state's critical infrastructure or otherwise impair the operation of critical infrastructure that provides public services. They also agreed that states shouldn't allow their territory to be used for cyber attacks against other states and should take steps to mitigate malicious activity emanating from their territory when it's aimed at critical infrastructure of other states. To recap what's been happening in Ukraine, shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine in February, Ukraine's Vice Prime Minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, issued a call for volunteer hacktivists to launch offensive cyber operations against Russia and provided a list of 31 government and commercial sector websites to attack. The aim was to erode the Russian public's support for the invasion by making their lives so unpleasant and inconvenient they'd question the war, and also to force Russia to focus on defending its own networks so that it might give less attention to attacking Ukraine's. The result, of course, was the IT Army, a quasi-civilian body that operates independent of the Ukrainian government, but also seems to have some nexus with Ukraine's military and intelligence apparatus. According to Stefan Sosanto of the Center for Security Studies in Switzerland. Sosanto has tracked the IT Army since its inception and published a great paper in June that I'd highly recommend. Within days of Fedorov's call of action, the IT Army launched DDoS attacks against the Moscow Stock Exchange, the Foreign Ministry, the Kremlin, and a state-owned bank. And the initial target list of 31 has expanded to more than 600, targeting a network of pharmacies, a large electronics retailer, and a Russian payment service provider after the company stated that US and EU sanctions against Russia hadn't affected it. They also hit the Russian government system for tracking the production and distribution of alcohol, which appeared to affect shipments of liquor prior to a holiday in May. And in addition, there are many offshoot groups, including members of Anonymous, who conduct operations under their own banner, not strictly under the IT Army banner. Most of the attacks, of course, have been DDoS campaigns, but massive hack and leak operations have also emerged. Two groups claimed responsibility for siphoning more than 200 gigabytes of emails from a Belarusian defense weapons manufacturer. Another group released industrial blueprints and schematics said to be from an engineering firm. And Anonymous claimed responsibility for 800 gigabytes of leaked data from Russia's Federal Censorship Bureau. In addition, there appears to be in-house teams conducting more sophisticated operations for the IT Army that either consists of Ukrainian defense and intelligence personnel or has direct ties to them and may also be getting tasking from them. Sosanto thinks this group is responsible for a destructive attack that struck RUtube, or RUtube, a Russian competitor to YouTube, which was dispensing misinformation about the war. The IT Army, with help from two specialists, they said, changed the passwords of RUtube's administrators, blocked access cards that staff used to get into RUtube server rooms, and erased dozens of petabytes of data, leaving RUtube offline for almost 3 days before it recovered with backups. A third element to the IT Army is the Ukrainian-owned security firms in and outside of Ukraine providing support tools. One company, headquartered in Estonia, is the maker of a tool called Disbalancer that works as a distributed defense against DDoS attacks. Users download the client to their phone or their computer in order to lend computing power to handle the load of DDoS attacks against other members. But in March, the Disbalancer team created a different tool called the Liberator that uses the same concept to actually conduct DDoS attacks against Russian sites. And another company in Estonia launched a bug bounty program seeking vulnerabilities in Russian critical infrastructure to pass to Ukrainian cyber forces to target. Despite the fact that these two companies are both based in Estonia, a member of NATO and the EU, their activity doesn't seem to have sparked any criticism from other NATO and EU member states. Obviously, there are unique circumstances to consider. Russia has been recognized by the United Nations as the clear aggressor in its invasion of Ukraine, and the cyber attacks launched by the IT Army and others is occurring during an active war. The IT Army also seems to be showing some restraint in not destroying or disrupting Russian emergency services. But Sosanto notes that this activity is in danger of setting unintended legal and ethical precedents that may create significant political blowback in the future. What if a Russian, this is a quote from him, what if a Russian-owned company located in Germany were to organize an offensive bug bounty program that targets Ukrainian critical infrastructure and shares the discovered vulnerabilities with the Russian intelligence community? Would Berlin, Brussels, and Washington deem this acceptable behavior by the private sector? And as critics point out, another problem is that it may be hard to rein in the IT Army and members of Anonymous after this. One can easily see such forces being harnessed by other governments or for causes other than the context of war, perhaps a diplomatic crisis, or even just in response to a cultural insult, as we saw in 2007 when Russian hacktivists launched targets against Ukraine for the relocation of a war memorial. Such a free-for-all, if targeted against critical infrastructure, has the potential to create chaos at the very least, and potentially worse. Sosanto says, continuing to ignore the essence of the IT Army will wreak havoc on the future stability of cyberspace, and with it the national security landscape in Europe and beyond. Viktor Zhora, deputy head of Ukraine's State Service of Special Communications and Information, who spoke here at Black Hat yesterday morning, told Motherboard earlier this year, "In my opinion, it would be wrong for the government to endorse this activity. But as a citizen, as a person who wishes our country to prevail in this absolutely unprecedented, unbelievable war in the 21st century, I would be grateful for their help in weakening our enemy." A couple of months ago, the Ukrainian government did appear to endorse the activity when the IT Army and Deputy Prime Minister Fedorov were given awards at a security conference in Poland for their heroic resistance, for their, quote, heroic resistance to Russian aggression and protection of the digital borders of the democratic world. Fedorov praised the IT Army for, quote, waging the world's first cyber war with us, end quote. Quickly, I wanted to mention Iran before I end. Recent events there, attacks that have disabled more than 4,000 gas pumps across the country and appeared to cause equipment malfunction at a fire at a steel plant. It caused equipment malfunction and a fire at a steel plant, raised similar concerns about attacking critical infrastructure outside of war. Though it's unclear if these were launched by hacktivists or the Israeli government or a Western government intelligence agency, they show that interest in critical infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, is very much on the agenda of attackers and will only become a greater target going forward. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Hey, thank you, everyone. I just have 2 notes before we get going. Our next sessions start at 10:20. So you've got a little bit of time to get over to the next session you want to see. And then tonight, opposite this keynote, we have our lock note. And our lock note will be our review board, some review board members who helped pick all the content for Black Hat, myself sitting down, exploring the content, the trends, the technologies that we found interesting, and we kind of chill out, we have a beer, we have a conversation, and the idea is that you have an opportunity to listen to us, have a conversation about what we found interesting, and then about halfway through, you get to get involved and start asking questions, and it's just a really nice way to wind down a hyper-connected conference. So I'll see you this evening at 4:20 p.m. Mandalay G&H on this floor, level 2. Mandalay G&H, lock note at 4:20. Thank you.